Do you remember what your first assignment was?
Stand out in Woburn Square and look smart, opposite the Common.
He said in the history of the Woburn Police Department, there never had been a Woburn policeman that was found froze to death or starved to death. And I spent the next 38 years in a coffee shop so I wouldn't starve to death.
Some people, if you just gave them a parking ticket, they never forget it. They wouldn't.
The day you die, they die.
Just a lousy parking ticket. They wouldn't speak to you for the rest of their life.
You didn't give out many tickets?
For me?
Yeah.
Oh, geez, 40 years.
How many do you think you gave in 40 years?
Oh, 40.
40.
You gotta have a little compassion to be a good police officer. You really have to have. You should like people, you know. You don't have to love them, but you should like them, you know.
The hardest thing doing is seeing a person really hurt in an accident or a domestic problem. That was the hardest pill for me to swallow. Especially when you saw a young child hurt bad, whether they were going to make it or not. That was the hardest part.
Two and 5 are tied up. Can you start for a 33 draft? Female party having shortness of breath.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
33. 5 is clear. Lou, if you want me to head over. On the Boston.
Okay, 5. Almost forgot about you. 10-4. 44 disregard.
10-4. Lou, you guys all set there?
10-4. Today we have a state-of-the-art police station with a high-tech communication systems and computers in every cruiser. But the origins of the department and the history of the department go back to a much simpler time in Woburn. Indeed, for nearly 200 years following the town's settlement in the 1640s, there was no real need for a police department. There was little crime in colonial days, and a local justice of the peace could issue arrest warrants and deputize an ordinary citizen to handle an occasional or isolated breach of the peace. Things began to change slightly with the coming of the Middlesex Canal to Woburn in 1803, with a resulting increase in the town's population and a small spurt of business growth. With the coming of the railroad, however, first to East Woburn in 1835 and then to Woburn Center in 1844, the town's population really began to grow. Tanneries and shoe factories were becoming well established. Just then, of course, thousands of Irish immigrants were pouring into Boston, fleeing the potato famines back home. In search of work, they were soon attracted to the jobs awaiting them in the leather shops and shoe factories of Woburn. The town's population grew significantly, and for the first real time, long-time inhabitants of the town began to notice a pronounced increase in crime. The Irish were different than the average Woburnite of the 1840s. They spoke differently, they were poorer, and they often looked even poorer than they were. They were rough and ragged, and while their strong backs were welcomed in the workplace, their social habits outside the workplace were anything but welcome by the old-line, native-born Woburnites, who were much more reserved in their social habits. And the Irish had one particular habit, of course, that completely shocked the conscience of those old-line Woburnites. They liked their liquor. And this was in a town where alcohol was strictly regulated and where it was only dispensed by a town liquor agent, and then only for medicinal purposes. In general, all of a sudden, things were changing a little too much for the average Woburnite of the day. They were seeing all of these foreigners. They were seeing an increase in petty crime, and they were seeing an increase in drunkenness and a little more rowdy public behavior than they liked. So it was no coincidence that citizens of the day began thinking that perhaps they needed a little something more in the way of law enforcement. And then in August 1847, in a crime called the boldest and most extensive robbery ever committed in town, thieves broke into the office and rifled the safe of the Woburn Agricultural and Mechanic Association, a private local lending institution of sorts for Woburn's business owners, stealing some $3,000. At the following annual Springtown meeting, the townspeople adopted a bylaw authorizing the annual appointment by the selectmen of 6 suitable, discreet, and efficient persons as police officers. The date was April 17, 1848, and with the passage of the bylaw, in a sense, the Woburn Police Department was born. Ironically, despite passage of the bylaw in 1848, the passions of the moment must have subsided for a bit, because there's no real evidence in the town records that the selectmen ever appointed any police officers for at least 3 years later. But then on April 24, 1851, the selectmen appointed William Warren, Thomas Page, Joseph Howard, Samuel Melendi, John Andrews, and Luther Holden. If the records are correct, these men were the first police officers in the town of Woburn. A chief was not appointed until 1856, when Selectmen Moses Wynn, Albert Thompson, and Elisha Burbank appointed Dwight F. Eager as the first chief of police. Through the rest of the 1850s and 1860s, the names changed, but the force, much like the town itself, continued to grow. Town reports show that as of 1861, Samuel Dolliver had become chief of police, and that as of 1863, some 11 persons were being paid for police services. There was no police station per se, but the town did construct 3 cells, or lockups as they call them, in the basement of the town hall. They were mostly dealing with petty crime and public misbehavior type of crime like drunkenness. Horace Collimore replaced Samuel Dolliver as chief, and he noted in his annual report for 1864 101 arrests during the year, and as he says, 7/8 of which relating to the sale of intoxicating liquors. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, this attempt to control the illegal sale of liquor was the #1 priority of the police department, and especially of Chief John Day, who led the department from 1866 until his death in 1874. If you were a police officer on Chief Day's force, you couldn't drink yourself, even off the job. You could be a smoker, but you couldn't smoke on duty. Day noted 174 arrests for the year 1868, almost all of which were for drunkenness. He complained in his reports about at least 60 places in town where liquor was being sold illegally. And of course, this whole issue was aimed primarily at one group of people, the Irish. It was a constant war on alcohol, or at least on the abuse of alcohol. And the Irish were perceived, rightly or wrongly, to be the villains. Not that they didn't complain, of course, but their complaints were often met with a curt response, like this one from Chief Day in his 1873 annual report. "We have been accused of particularity, and that we prosecute none but foreigners. Our answer is, that of the 50 or more rum sellers in this town, not one is an American-born citizen. Consequently, there are none but foreigners to prosecute." The police station, such as it was during this era, occupied a portion of the basement of the town hall, the building to the right in this old photo. In 1873, on the recommendation of Chief Day, 3 additional lockups were constructed in the outlying areas of the town, with 1 lockup each constructed inside the fire stations. And lo and behold, in 1881, the first Irish Catholic was elected to the Board of Selectmen, Lawrence Reed. And lo and behold, as well, some Irish started getting appointed to the police force. So by the early 1880s, for example, the chief might still have been named Charles Conn, but his police force included men with last names of Walsh, McHugh, Kerrigan, McKenna, and Mulkeen. The early 1880s saw the town lease extra space for a police office in the Lyceum Hall building on Main Street in Woburn Center, though the cells or lockups remained in the basement of the town hall. These same years saw a telephone installed in the police office for the first time. By the middle of the decade, a standardized uniform was adopted and put in place. The force by 1890 consisted of a chief, who was by then full-time, 7 other full-time officers, and several special officers who still worked part-time. The chief of police at the time was William R Mcintosh, who had been appointed in 1888 by the town selectmen. In a sense, he would be the last town of Woburn's police chief, and the first chief of the city of Woburn, following the town's change to a city form of government in 1889. Under Chief McIntosh, major renovations occurred at the 2 municipal buildings on Common Street. All town offices were switched to the building to the east, closest to Main Street, and the building to the west, next to the railroad station, was converted to a combination police station and district court. Expanded space and 11 new cells were added to the police station portion of the building. The station would remain there until the building of a new city hall in the early 1930s. In 1895, Charles F. McDermott was appointed the new chief of police. He would lead the department for the next 25 years and died in office in 1920. His force in 1895 made 906 arrests for the year, 669 of which were for drunkenness. In 1897, Thomas Mulkeen was appointed as the department's first lieutenant. Somewhat remarkably, Mulkeen would serve on the force a total of 57 years, retiring in 1937 at the age of 90. The turn of a new century saw Woburn continuing to grow in both population and business. The city's tanneries were continuing to attract immigrant laborers, not only from Ireland, but many from Italy, Greece, and the Scandinavian countries as well. Chief McDermott and his force, consisting of Lieutenant Mulkeen and 14 full-time patrolmen, however, faced the usual crimes, with public drunkenness being the leading cause of arrest. They faced some excitement one particular evening in 1908, however, when a trio of thugs, or yeggmen as the slang of the day would have called them, paid a visit to Woburn Center. The gang had started their crime spree with an armed robbery in the Pinehurst area of Billerica, and area departments were alerted to be on the lookout. When 3 strangers fitting the description hopped off the trolley car near the Unitarian Church an hour or so later, they quickly attracted the attention of several of Woburn's finest. The 3 suspects walked south along the common. Officers Timothy Walsh, Edward O'Neill, and Edward Fountain fell in behind them. The yeggmen crossed Common Street and quickly strode aside the wrought iron fence in front of the Congregational Church. As they turned down Church Street, in front of the 4-story Dow block, they glanced back over their shoulders and quickened their step. The officers kept pace. Finally, as the men approached the railroad crossing, Walsh called out for them to halt, and halt at first they did. But a moment later they wheeled to face their pursuers and let go with a fusillade of shots from automatic weapons. Walsh took a bullet in the abdomen and slumped to the ground. 2 bullets slammed into the ankle and foot of O'Neill, and he too fell to the ground in agony. Whistles blew, bystanders screamed, and the yeggmen took off in flight, with 2 running up and over Church Street, and 1 running down the railroad tracks, and then scampering up the majestic front lawn of the Dow estate, and disappearing from view from the pursuing Officer Fountain. But their crime spree was not over, and 2 civilians would also be shot in the yeggmen's attempt to get away, including a 12-year-old boy, Sherwood Van Tassel, who was returning from playing hockey on Horn Pond and stumbled into the fleeing yeggmen on Sturgis Street. 2 of the 3 were caught the next morning in Arlington. The 3rd yeggman was never captured. The years that followed and the years leading up to the First World War were relatively quiet, and the force would stay the same in size, averaging about 15 men in total for the next decade. Younger patrolmen joining the force during the years between 1910 and 1920 included Charles R. Macaulay, Edward H. MacDonald, Alonzo O'Brien, William H. Sweeney, and Lawrence M. Brophy. There were the continual attempts to crack down on the illegal sale of liquor, and public drunkenness continued to be the leading cause of arrest. The force was also put to the test during the great influenza epidemic that struck the nation in the fall of 1918, and which claimed over 1 million deaths nationwide. In Woburn's case, over 50 people died from the disease between September and December of that year. Schools, movie theaters, and even churches were closed for weeks in an effort to stop the contagious spread of the disease, while police officers in some cities and towns actually refused to transport sick people or refused to handle dead bodies. Woburn's finest carried out their duties in admirable fashion and without complaint. On January 29, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect, and the entire nation went dry. Law enforcement agencies throughout the land were about to try their hand at enforcing what would ultimately turn out to be unenforceable. In Woburn's case, of course, the task initially fell on the shoulders of Chief McDermott, a member of the force since 1887 and chief since 1895. The chief died, however, in June 1920. Lieutenant Thomas Mulkeen served an interim period as acting chief, while Mayor Bernard Golden contemplated a successor. In March 1921, he had made his choice and appointed Officer Charles R. Macaulay, a patrolman since 1912, as the next chief of police. Macaulay would lead the department for nearly 3 full decades. The new chief immediately formed a special liquor squad and did his best to enforce the unenforceable throughout the decade. The chief's immediate boss, however, was the mayor, with 2 in particular, Mayor Thomas H. Duffy and Mayor Harold P. Johnson, choosing to lead liquor raids themselves. Duffy in particular held the chief's feet to the fire, so to speak, pledging in his inaugural address in 1925 to rid the city of bootleggers, and announcing at a specially called meeting of the police force a few days later, "I will clear up the liquor situation, even if I have to discharge the entire police department. I will have a clean city, and that's all there is to it." The 1920s had also seen some older men retire, and some younger men appointed to replace them, among them William Kenny, John McCarthy, John Kelly, Arthur Fay, Dave Folan, William P. Dever, Edward Walsh, and Edward Rex Reel. Entering the decade of the 1920s, a patrolman's annual pay was $1,500, raised to $2,100 by the decade's end. A sergeant made $2,300 by 1929, while the chief made $2,865 by the same year. Reserves were paid 65 cents an hour. For the most part, however, aside from liquor enforcement and a new set of traffic ordinances promulgated during the 1920s, things were relatively calm day in and day out. There were exceptions, of course, any one of which would serve to point out that the job was more than just parades and directing traffic. The job carried with it a daily risk of harm. On November 25, 1927, Patrolman William Kenny responded to a domestic violence call in North Woburn, where he was attacked with an axe, wielded by what the newspaper of the day called a rum-crazed assailant. He was struck in the head and hovered between life and death for several months. Though he survived and would live another 21 years, he never truly recovered from the effects of the blow and was never able to work again. He died in 1948. A major event in the department's history occurred in 1930, when the city decided it was time to replace their two aged wooden buildings on Common Street. A new city hall was the result, and the police department had a new home. Opened in August 1931, with virtually the entire basement floor dedicated to the police department, the new station featured a state-of-the-art Gamewell communications system, an expanded locker room and shower area, a pistol firing range, and a 3-bay garage at the rear of the facility. It would be the home of the department for nearly 60 years. As of the opening of the station in 1931, the force consisted of 17 men in all, with 12 patrolmen and a command staff consisting of Chief McCauley, Lieutenant Mulkeen, and Sergeants Michael Hickey, Timothy Walsh, and William H. Sweeney. A typical year during the 1930s might see about 600 arrests, with most, over 400 in most years, for public drunkenness.
What was like the worst thing these police had to deal with, do you think?
20s and 30s with drunks in the city. You know,
That's what
we
I
have
hear,
full of barroom. Even my own, where we lived in the corner of Border Street and Main Street, there was the Town Line Tavern across the street. There was the Bucket of Blood, we used to call it, on Cross Street. And there was the Portuguese Club at the corner of Cranes Lane and Main Street. And Jock O'Connell ran one at the corner of Lake Avenue and Main Street.
And
So
that's
there was four within 50 yards of our house. And the fights, you know, they all came up from Winchester and every place, you know, and no one had an automobile. So they would all congregate in these places. And at 12 o'clock when the bar closed, they would all go outside and they would either sing loud songs all together, which was a thing at that time, or they'd have a big fist fight. And they were forever on our front porch or back porch.
These years of the 1930s were in general dominated by the fact that the city and the nation were experiencing some hard economic times. Banks were failing, homes were being foreclosed, and many had to seek public assistance in order to survive. The country was in the midst of the Great Depression. On the city front, times were indeed tough, and when an outspoken mayoral candidate promised taxpayers relief, and promised to provide it by shaking up City Hall like it had never been shaken up before, the taxpayers decided to give the man a try. His name was William E. Kane.
Now, he got elected 6 times.
Yeah, he certainly did. Then in the wintertime, he didn't plow sidewalks at all. That was a no-no. Didn't plow any sidewalks whatsoever. So we used to have to walk on the street. But then when it snowed, he didn't plow the streets. All you had was 2 big ruts going up Main Street on each side. And you had to walk on the road.
And he had a flair for the dramatic, as in his proposal to curb public drunkenness and drunk driving, for example, by putting offenders in a circus-like animal cage to be pulled around the city.
Now, do you remember this so-called cage and putting
yeah, he made, oh yes, very vividly. Pelagi made the cage. And in fact, Kane never paid Pelagi for making the cage. But he used to parade it around, but no one ever was in the cage. No one ever got in that cage. No drunks ever got in that cage. No matter what anyone tells you, they didn't get in that cage. He used to parade the cage down through, and all the people would get a big kick out of that.
Was it horse-drawn?
Yes, horse-drawn. And in fact, Mayor Kane used to go in all the barrooms up on Woburn Square, which was another 10 or 12 in a barroom, and if he found anyone there on welfare in the barroom, they were off of welfare right then and there.
He checked them out.
Right, was it right then and there? They were off of welfare. And he was the one that was responsible for shutting down the barrooms. The majority of all the people thought he was grand. That's why they elected him 6 times. But the rest of the people that were directly involved in it weren't so happy about it. Like he laid off almost all the public works and teachers and so forth and so on.
And when longtime Fire Chief Frank Tracy retired in July 1938, Kane chose his own brother, Michael Kane, to replace him. Michael was not a member of the fire department, and in fact had no prior firefighting experience whatsoever, but rather had run a retail fish truck.
Then, for the fire department, he originally in the wintertime, took the windows out of the fire station. Then he took the beds out of the fire station. So they had no windows, no bed, and the trucks would freeze up when it got so cold. They couldn't start them, couldn't pump water because the water they carried froze up.
Every firefighter, except for Chief Kane, filed a lawsuit against the mayor for back wages. The mayor responded by ordering all of the beds removed from the stations and referred to the firefighters as the only people he knew who got paid for sleeping. 2 days following the firefighters' suit, every single member of the police department, including Chief McCauley, likewise filed a lawsuit for back wages. The mayor ordered that all police shifts were henceforth to be extended to 13 hours long. Further, he ordered Chief McCauley to walk a beat in the square. But Kane had even more in store for the police department, and within a couple of weeks announced that he was forming a mounted division within the department. He picked out 3 of the oldest, broadest horses at the city poor farm, and then ordered 3 of Woburn's finest to mount up. He selected Sergeant William P. Dever and officers James Tenney and Henry Dion, all 3 of whom tipped their respective scales at well over 200 pounds. He arranged a quick riding lesson around the city poor farm, and then sent his Mounties out to patrol Woburn Square. The Boston newspapers were alerted, and thousands of spectators flocked to the center to see Kane's cavalry, as they were quickly dubbed by the press.
And he got the 3 biggest cops that he could find. And they had a poor farm where the Kennedy Middle School is right now. That was a Woburn poor farm. And they had great big work horses. And he made the cops ride the 3 horses from the poor farm down around the common and then back. 3 big guys, and then they took it. Because they came by at about 9 o'clock at night, and of course all the Gorons emptied out into the street to see and these fellas waved to everyone. They took it jovially. Someone else would have, been really gone. But I was surprised that night. They had a bit of fun out of the thing. So. But that drew a big crowd in Woburn. Oh my God, there was thousands and thousands of people that came there. Very humiliating, I would say, to the individuals involved,
Oh.
And for no reason whatsoever other than...
And there was no unions or anything?
No, and just to gain publicity, that's all.
As long as he was mayor, I never got a job. And people say, "Did you go to his wake?" And I said, "Yes." How come? Bob McGann, if you're alive, he'd tell you the same thing. We went together. How come? We just wanted to make sure it was him that was there.
There would be more battles, including a brief time in the later 1940s when Kane brought in the state police, claiming Woburn's finest were incapable of ridding the city of its illegal gambling dens.
How about the time up in Walnut Street that he went up and took somebody out of a babooty game?
Oh, that was my father.
Your father did that?
Yeah.
Tell me, come on now, you
No,
guys.
Ed was in the game.
Oh.
I
Tell
might
us
have been
that.
rolling the dice when he came in, I don't know.
We're riding home, see, and I'm young, and we're in the car, and my father looked up Walnut Street. I saw him look up Walnut Street and sort of slow down, and we headed home. This is a Sunday, I think, and we get in, and he says, "I'm going back downtown." I said, "Oh, can I go?" "No, I'm going by myself." And I remember saying, "Well, what's he going downtown for? It's Sunday, everything's closed, and blah, blah, blah." "Keep quiet, he's going downtown."
And you...
How to drag Ed out of the babooty game, I guess.
And where was the and what is babooty?
Walnut Street.
Oh, it's gambling.
Is it a game, or...?
Oh, yes, with dice. It's 4 ways of winning, 4 ways of losing. 1 and 1, 1 and 2, 2 and 2, and 4 and 4, lose. 6 and 6, 6 and 5, 3 and 3,
You're talking
win.
to a professional, and you
Yeah,
know.
that was those big games. They were big games.
What'd your father say?
Get out. Come on, let's get out of here.
How did he see you, Ed?
He saw the car. He saw the car on Walnut Street. He knew what was going on up there.
That was funny that
They
day.
were wild games.
In the late 1940s saw him finally appoint several young men as permanent patrolmen, including Hubert Garrity, Arthur McElhenney, Bernard Golden, Albert Flaherty, and a young man who would soon make his mark in a leadership role, Thomas McGuire.
Okay. When were you born?
3/15/20.
1920.
1920.
And you're born in Woburn?
Born in Woburn at the Choate Hospital on Warren Avenue.
And who is your mother and father?
Oh, my father was mayor at the time, and my mother came from Lowell. Her name was Quinn.
Quinn. How long was your father mayor for?
4 years.
Were you appointed by what mayor?
William E. Kane.
Yes, Mayor Kane. Mayor Kane. What do you remember about him? There were a lot of stories about him. And
There is a lot. He was a character.
yeah. How long were you a patrolman before you decided to take an exam and maybe go on to do other things? You know, like
20
such.
years.
20 years.
Yeah.
Really?
1968, that's when I became a sergeant.
1968?
Yeah.
On January 2nd, 1950, Francis H. Murray took the oath of office as mayor of the city. On August 2nd, 1950, Chief Macaulay turned 65 years of age and retired. He had managed to outlast his old political nemesis, Mayor Kane. He had served over 38 years on the force.
He was a very well-respected individual. Everyone liked him. He was a very fair person. I never heard a bad word about Charlie Macaulay.
I used to work at Tabbitt's Dairy. Used to be old timers. Go by and they'd say, "Get a job on civil service, and you'll never have to worry." And that was the best advice you could ever get.
Right, right. Especially
Yeah.
after the war with so many veterans coming back.
Oh yeah, see, it was a lot different down there in Woburn Center then. God,
What was Woburn Center like, Bud? Then?
When I first went on, it was so busy you couldn't believe it, Kathy. You could get that bus to go up in Medford all the way up to North Woburn, turn around. There was only standing room only. The crowds on the sidewalk were so crowded, they'd be bumping into one another as you're walking. And we was a reserve. We used to work nights, Thursday and Friday nights, and sometimes Saturday as reserves, just to do traffic. There was a man in the lights at Montfield Avenue. There was a man at front of Larry Murphy's. There was a man on Walnut and Main Street. Another one up at Union Street, and also at Salem Street. They'd put a man there and they'd be busy.
In July 1951, the department got a new chief when Mayor Murray appointed 37-year-old Thomas J. McGuire to lead the department. Elevated directly from the rank of patrolman, he would lead the department for the next 27 years, retiring in 1978. He was assisted as he started his duties by a command staff consisting of Lieutenants James Tenney, Joseph Doherty, and Edward Walsh, and Sergeants William H. Sweeney, Hubert Garrity, and Edward Rex Reel. Together, they and a few veteran patrolmen would welcome an entirely new crop of rookies, as every year of the decade brought more appointments to an expanding force. To any young man who joined the force in this ever-changing decade of the 1950s, the memories of that first shift, that first assignment, those early days, the advice from veterans, the wrath of a superior, all of those things about being a young patrolman in the 1950s remain vivid in their memories.
John O'Donnell, John F. O'Donnell, all right, born on 19 Stoddard Street, 85 years ago. So,
Name your brothers and sisters, because I'm the oldest of 11.
Winnie, Georgie, Jimmy, Joe, and then there's John, Tommy, Frankie, Larry, Catherine with a C, Ellen, and Huey. There was 7 of us in World War II.
When did you go on, John?
I went on 51. I was on the reserve list for a while. But the Lord Mayor Kane, who I didn't have a good relationship with, no more than Mike McGann's father, but I happened to go up at the same time with his brother Bob, looking for a job after the war. We were on the list. And we were politely told, or not so politely told, as long as he was mayor, we wouldn't get a job. And as long as he was mayor, I didn't get a job.
Hey, listen, talk about your brother Larry. Would you do that for me? When did he go on the police force? You said about a year.
Larry went on in 1950, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how did he get on?
Kane.
Oh, it was Kane.
Kane. Larry went on under Kane, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Who went on with him? Your brother?
And I think Leo went on right behind Larry, I think. Yeah.
Between you, the two of you?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And in between that, I think it was Leo Power went on after Leo. Bobby Dowd. So I'm naming all these guys now. They're all gone.
I know they are.
So,
I know they are. Sad, huh?
It is. A lot of these people, when I went on, they were all Woburites. They were all Woburites.
So you all
everybody
knew
knew everybody, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And Dick Bennett, he was a stranger. He came from Burlington.
My name is John P. Gibbons, Jr. I was born March 27th, 1928 in Woburn, and I've lived all my life in the city of Woburn. I was appointed regular on November 14th, 1950 with Joe Lally.
Do you remember your first assignment?
My first assignment, yes. The first assignment was in North Woburn.
Everybody seems to go to North Woburn.
when I first went on the police department in 1950, there was no such a thing. We weren't lucky enough to have an academy that they have today. I went on the police department, and Jim Tenney was the acting chief at the time. I was appointed upstairs, and Margaret Kane, the city clerk, swore Joe Lally and I in. We came downstairs to the office, and we were rushing into the Chief Tenney's office, and at that time he presented me with two badges, one for my hat and one for my jacket, and he gave me a police positive 38 and 6 bullets, and he never asked me if I knew how to put the bullets in the gun or not.
David Sweeney, my date of birth was 7/20/32, was born in Woburn. Then I went on the police department in 58 because the bottom fell out as far as the economy went in the late 50s.
Now, your dad retired in 1953.
Yes.
Did he encourage you to go on the police department?
No, I wanted to go on myself.
You did?
Yeah.
Did he give you any advice?
No, not at all. Because my father, the reason I wanted to go on was the GE was shaky in those days, very shaky. And so I wanted a job where I could have some security. I was sworn in alone.
You were.
And the mayor that swore me in was my brother-in-law, Bill Shaughnessy.
When you first went on, what type of training did you get?
Not what they do today. We just went to, God be good to him, Joe Doherty. He was a wonderful guy. He just gave us some instructions upstairs in the old city hall.
Did you start off walking in the square?
Yes, we walked in the square, and you bring up Woburn Square. When I went on in 58, Woburn Square was a bustling hub. I mean a bustling hub. On a Friday night, 5 police officers in the square.
I'm born April 13th, 1922 in Woburn. Yeah.
And Kenny, when are you born?
August 25th, 1927.
1927.
Born in Woburn and been here all our lives.
What year did you go on, by the way?
I went on the regular in 1951.
1951. Yeah. And what was your first assignment when you did go on?
Working nights and walking a beat in the square, the south end, the freight yards, North Woburn, Central Square, and the west side. We had a lot of walking beats in those days. Because we had only a few cruisers.
Mm-hmm.
And we had the 2 doors.
Went on at 55.
So Kenny went on ahead of you then?
Oh yeah. You talk about first assignment. I was assigned to South End, John Kelly. And he's driving the cruiser and he gets me down to South End. You gotta know John Kelly. He said, listen Murphy, this is your route. He drove me through the South End in about 2 minutes. This is your route. Remember, I don't want to see you till 1 o'clock. You got to understand this guy. Gruff voice and everything else. I said, okay. And he meant 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock. We get through at 1 o'clock. You know, you had to walk up from the South End. Our box was down at Main and Porter. You had to run that in and walk up a station. But just the idea, this is your route. I'll see you later. I never saw him again.
What was he like, Officer Kelly?
Well, you delete this and I'll tell you.
How long were you a patrolman, Ken?
I was a patrolman before I made sergeant, 4 years.
And then you became sergeant, and
Then
did you?
lieutenant and captain, and then the chief in '78.
Yeah.
On the same day that Mayor Murray appointed Tom McGuire as chief, he also appointed Al Matrano as a permanent patrolman. He was the first Woburn police officer of Italian descent. In the years and decade that followed, he would be joined by fellow Italian-Americans George Caiampo, Ollie Galanti, Sammy Charay, Bobby Charay, Doe Negri, Eddie Tedesco, and others.
Oliver C. Galanti, Bethel, Vermont, July 12, 1919.
1919. Who else was born in Bethel, Vermont?
George Caiampo was born, I believe, the next door, but he was born in April, and I was born in July.
Who went on with you?
I went on with Pete O'Brien, Jimmy Murphy, Arthur McFaig, and Earl Gonzalez. Okie O'Connor.
My name is Bob Charay. I was born October 7th, 1932. Born in Woburn. Lived here all my life.
Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, Dominic Negri. I was born in Jamaica Plain, February 9th, 1931. And I went to school at the old Woburn High School. Graduated in 1951. And from there I went in the service.
I want to ask before I close about your brother, because your brother, he went on, and
Sam?
Your brother had an accident. Is
Yeah,
that,
in,
was
50,
it on,
in 57.
In
He was
1957.
he was on Arlington Road, checking for speeders. Then he used to meet the school buses in the morning. So he was going over to the Parker School, over at the Four Corners. And he's coming down Pleasant Street. There used to be a little store there, Spencer's store, right where the gas station is. Right. And the Bond bread truck was pulling out of Ella Street there. Pulled up, made like a U-turn to pull out. And Sam was coming down right on the side of the truck, head first. That's before they wore helmets. And he ended up with a fractured skull.
ended his
He
career?
ended
yeah.
up retiring, yeah.
He did. Do you remember Al Matrano and?
Oh, sure. And I remember the one case in particular that Al had played a big hand in, and he and Dick Johnson, Bixby's house up in the main street was, part of it was blown up one morning. And the police were searching the area, and Al and Dick Johnson came across this fellow in the phone booth across from the fire station. His pants and legs and everything else was soaking wet. He did the bombing and ran across the street through the swamp. And he came down to make a phone call because whoever was supposed to pick him up missed him. So he was calling for the ride, and Al and Dick Johnson came along, and I caught him right there.
The social fabric of the department appeared closely woven throughout the decade and beyond. Veterans and newcomers alike would come together in social settings, particularly to support fundraising efforts for the Woburn Police Relief Association. Black tie events with grand processions were not uncommon, and a concert and ball were annual events well into the 1960s. A Police Wives Association was also very active throughout the era, and lent their financial and social aid to many a charitable cause in the community. The newer men had also jumped into efforts to give kids something to do. Leo McElhenney and Ken Murphy would co-found the Police Athletic League, or PAL, program, and a number of their fellow officers would help out with coaching baseball games, refereeing basketball games, or otherwise assisting in some other manner.
And the toughest part was going into the house there with a broken home, and the little girl would probably have the mother by her apron, and the father, the little boy would be grabbing his father's pant leg, and they'd be crying, and the mother and father would be arguing back and forth, and you'd going, okay, hold it, quiet down. See what your cards in here, little boy crying, little girl crying because the parents were fighting. That was really.
Huey he was actually discharged from the service, but still he hadn't completed his time, to actually get his discharge. And he was killed with a young net kid up in Wynn Street. Larry went to that accident, which was...
Your brother was a police officer.
Yeah, he was. And I remember Huey was a great kid. But I remember that it was a sorrowful night because, like I say, there were 7 of us that went to war. We come back unscathed. Of course, where I went, it didn't matter anyway. I never saw much action. I just went where they sent me. But that night, Larry come. I was living around the corner of my brother's house. Larry came in, but he come right in the house, went upstairs, and got me out of bed to get down and tell my mother and father because he couldn't do it, So.
Were you a police officer then?
I was on the reserve then. Yeah,
you were on the reserve, but Larry had been on for how long?
Larry had been on, probably a year and a half before. He was younger than I, but he went on.
Did he see your brother at the accident?
He stepped over him. When he got there, the chief of police, McEachran, from Burlington, said, "Larry, forget this fellow." He says, "He's gone." So Larry stepped over him with, to help on the other parties who were injured there. And when he got in the ambulance, one of the kids sort of come to, and he realized it was Larry, and he said, "Larry, how's Huey?" And as soon as he said that, he knew that who he stepped over was Huey. So it was tough on him.
Oh, yeah.
And it affected him. It really affected him
for the rest of his life.
To go to an accident. Yeah.
Right.
But I mean, those are the things you run into. Being a police officer. Well,
There was one night, St. Patty's Day, there was an accident down in Main Street in front of where Green's Diner used to be, at the corner of corner of Fowl Street and Main Street. It happened at 4 o'clock in the morning. There was something like 9 people that were badly injured, and we took them to the hospital. And with 9 people being brought in, one right after the other, we had to make a decision at the scene of the accident which ones we thought were the most seriously hurt. And as it turned out, the ones that we thought were the most seriously hurt were. And those doctors and nurses, you never saw anybody work as hard as they did with the 9 people. I can remember Dr. Drago saying to me at the time, he said, "Jack, hold this person." One person's was practically scalped. The head was back, the hair was way back here, and it was just the bare scalp up here, and the hair was back. He pulled the hair forward and he cleaned it, and irrigated it all around, got the dirt and everything else over the room, and brought the thing forward. And he said, just hold your finger right there for a minute while I stitch here. And he stitched it up. And the nurses were all running around taking care of everybody. But everybody knew what they had to do up there, and they did it. And there was no arguing or complaining, "I'm doing more than you're doing." They couldn't do enough for their patients.
Bobby, what is the toughest thing you've ever seen being a policeman?
The kids always bother you. Something with a kid. The shaken baby syndrome, stuff like that. I went to an accident up at 128 one time. I was with the inspector from the registry. We were just out checking something. A truck tipped over, right over 128 on 93 going north. They were going up to get a load of hot top, and the cab burned. And the father and son were in the cab. They were burned to a crisp.
And on that case, when they got there, he tried to get out, and his hands were on the door, and the kid was all burnt. Yeah. In that case up there.
See, that's so hard.
Yeah.
That's
Another
bad.
time there was a bus going north on 93 up near where the rest area used to be there by Dragon Court, and car come right across the road, hit the bus head on. A bunch of people on the bus didn't get hurt, but the guy His brains are all over the highway. And the medical examiner came. No gloves on, picking up the bread. Ah, you know.
I liked the job, and I liked the people, you know. And it was a job that a lot of sadness to it, a lot of sadness. We saw an awful lot of sad things, you know. And nothing was worse than when a child was hurt or whatnot. And one of the worst ones was up in just above Central Square when this couple come down and they hit one of the big trees, which is no longer there. And there was, we had cleared the area probably a half an hour afterwards. We were getting ready to leave. And the mother and father were killed, but there was a child in the car who was also killed, but we didn't know the child was there.
It was a car accident, John?
It was a car accident, yeah. So that was prior to, no, that was after my brother had been in the accident. So
after you lost your own brother in a car
right.
accident.
So that was tough, but it was tough seeing a child, you know. And then you go to some accidents, you know. And there was one youngster one time who got caught up in a trash truck, you know.
Oh.
He reached in the trash truck as the thing was coming down. He was pulled in. That was a sad affair.
Some guys, you cover an accident, they just couldn't take the sight of blood. Not because I'm a professional doctor or anything, but you had to get adjusted to it. There was some, like I said, there was a lot of blood, broken bones, etc. And some guys just couldn't take it. You know?
One case that really, really bothered me, and for a long, long time, was this little boy up in North Woburn, got hit by the train. Yeah. And he had a little army jacket on, with, you know, it had all different patches on. He had sergeant stripes on there, and he got hit in the train. I think he was 4 years old. And there was like a skull. When the train stopped, it was right embedded inside the rail, you know, the little grate they have, and then that's where it was. And the medical examiner, he was up, Dr. Dorego, he was up there, and he was picking up pieces, the leg, little part of the leg like that there, you know, no shoe on, just the thing. And in fact, Leo Powers was up there too, and he heaved his guts out over in the corner. It was a real bad scene, and I think everybody got sick just seeing him. And the medical examiner, Dr. Dorego, he was up there with a bag picking up all the body parts. You know, I guess he sees it all the time, but I think that was as bad as any.
You really have to have a release, don't you think?
Right. I remember one day in particular in Children's Hospital, we had taken a child in, and Barry and I were in, and there was this telescope that came down from the ceiling all the way. It kept reducing in size all the way down. It was probably about 4 feet diameter at the top, and it came down, and there was this little bitty thing sticking in the baby's eye. Like, you know, the baby was looking out a binocular.
Right.
It was right into the eye, and it went all the way up to the roof of the thing. And Barry and I were in that. We brought the baby that we had into the same section, and we saw this. And we walked out, and we're standing by the elevator waiting to go downstairs. And Barry said to me, he says, "God, that was awful." He says, "There's a lot of terrible sights in here." And I says, "Oh yes," I says, "that's a lot of terrible things you see in this place." Just as I said that, the elevator door opened, and about 9 beautiful young girls in their teens that were studying to be nurses walked out. Barry looks at me and he says, "And there's a lot of healthy ones here too." But I mean, it's things like that.
That's right.
That
break
up
the moment.
1 minute you're
right.
all tensed up, you know, and then somebody comes out with something funny like that, and you laugh for a half an hour afterward.
And we got a call to go to the leather shop on Campbell Street, we're across from the high school, that a guy a worker had fallen in the vat, the acid vat. So we went up in the ambulance and so forth, and we're taking him out. We got him on a stretcher. And in those days, when you put the stretcher in the back of the ambulance, you had to lock it in on the lever on the left-hand side so he wouldn't go all over the back of the ambulance. Well, this cop with me, we got him, one of the workers was out. He runs around and jumps behind the wheel. And we got the patient, I think he was dead at that time anyway. We got him halfway in. And off he goes in the air. He steps on the gas. And I'm running behind him, holding on to the stretcher. Screaming at him.
He didn't hear you?
He did, he slams on the brakes. Of course, the stretcher and me went flying all over the place. It was terrible. I said to him afterwards, I said, if he wasn't dead, he certainly was.
Well, Jim Tenney was a lieutenant at the time on the desk. And, I don't think he was a lieutenant, but it doesn't make any difference. He was in the station, I was in the station. And a call came in for the ambulance. So Jim was a very go-go guy. And he was a heavy-set guy. And he ran out to the back of the garage, get in the ambulance, forgot to raise the doors to let the ambulance out, and he went through the doors.
No, really?
Yeah.
Dan and I, one time, we went down to a house, and there was this fellow. He must have been 6'6". Of course, at the time, he looked 7'8", and he weighed about 250. This is no lie. And there was snow, like we had this year, snow. So his wife wanted him out of the house. In those days, you could take him out. If you're drinking, the wife wanted him out of the house, you could take him. So we walked into this house, and she said, I want him out of the house. So he says, I'll only be too glad to go with you, he says. But then he sat down, and he said, now, he says, supposing I don't want to go. So we said, well, if you don't want to go, we got to make an attempt, and if we don't get you out, then we'll have to call for more. We'll get you out. Right? And he says, all right, he says, I'll go. Now we get out on the sidewalk, and the first thing you know, he says, I don't want to go. Now Dan's on one arm, I'm on the other. And he shook us off like fleas. And then all of a sudden he just, the heck with it. He says, I'll go with you. Now we got to find Dan's hat. It's lost in the snowdrift. So we never let Dan forget that. But we got him up behind the station, and again he lit up. But I mean, by that time they knew we were coming, so there's a couple of guys who were getting out of, they were just changing shifts, so we come back, and he shook us off like fleas, and next thing you know, you get 6 or 7 guys on him. So he just...
Big guy, though.
He was a big guy. Oh, yeah, he was a big guy.
Do you remember your first assignment?
Yep. The first day I ever worked, it was Route 1 that was in front of the banks. How I remember it. I went on at 8 o'clock. First time I was ever on the beat out there. In the Woburn National Bank, the alarm went off. I thought, gee, well, here it is, all these years they had. I get on one day and they have an alarm. But I saw a guy coming out I knew, Bob Gibbons, I don't remember. Hey, Bob, how you doing? How's everything in there? Oh, fine, brother. That's just to call me brother. I said, okay, thanks. And I went in, everything was okay. It was just an alarm, that's all.
But it scared you as your first call.
The first day, you say, what the hell do I do?
One time, I got a call to visit this house, a disturbance, husband and wife fighting. I rapped at the door opened, and the lady threw the suitcase out at me. She threw it in and broke open, and she cried like heck, and she grabbed me. Oh, I thought it was that if that so-and-so, my husband, this, she was so sorry, this and that. I said, well, you're lucky it didn't hit me. I would have had you for assaulting a police officer.
With a suitcase.
The East Woburn car, when they had to take a prisoner to Bridgewater, that was the car they used to go to Bridgewater. So I didn't know how to get to Bridgewater, so it was my job to take him. So I had him in the car, and he had the shakes, and we were going. So he stopped off, and we got him a little nip, and he took that, and he was quiet as a mouse. Now, I didn't know how to get to Bridgewater State Farm. So he's telling me, take this road here, go ahead down there, and this and that. And
the guy you're bringing.
He knew exactly where it was, and they loved him there. As soon as they saw him come in, they assigned him to the hospital, where he was very good. He could bandage, he could do a lot of things for the hospital.
Rexfield, oh, he told us so often, yeah. But I remember one time Leo Mack and I were working the square. Cold, oh, it was cold. So I come up the street, and it was Saturday morning. And there was a lot of people out Saturdays in those days, you know. Woburn was a busy place. And he'd come up the street about 10:30 and he'd say, we're out in the street. So he'd say, what are you doing out? Weather like this, he says. You get inside, you hide, you get a coffee, you know. So Leo and I, after he left, Leo says, let's go. Or I said, neither one of us anyway. So we went into Charlie Annis's. We weren't in there 3 minutes when, wow, income. Wow, what are you doing in there? He said, get the hell out in the street where you belong. So out in the street we go. And then we get out there. And we said, hey, you told us to go in. He says, I had to make a story up, he says, for those people in there. He said, what's the matter with you? He says, when I leave, you can go in.
The force continued to grow by leaps and bounds, with a host of appointments made by Mayors Jack Gilgun and Edward Gill. The first radar unit was obtained in 1963, with Officer Bob Charay the first to use it, followed by others, with over 45 speeders bagged over the long Labor Day weekend that year. The force continued to see changes in its ethnicity, as the first African American, John Fields, would be appointed. Fields, in fact, would make his own mark with the radar unit and would become an all-too-familiar sight to many a speeding motorist in the decades that followed. As Chief McGuire and his force entered the latter years of the 1960s and the early years of the 1970s, they would confront some troubling times. The nation and society had changed, with issues ranging from long hair or musical tastes to the Vietnam War, protests against the draft, and general societal unrest. These officers suddenly found that the deference and respect that had been afforded them in an earlier era was suddenly gone. Authority was being questioned at every level, and the officer on the beat was the first to notice. In Woburn's case in particular, a long simmering pot of unrest and resentment toward authority was about to boil over.